Hello and welcome to the second lesson on poems in the Power and Conflict anthology. Today we'll be covering London by William Blake. Let's start off by listening to a reading of the poem by Comics and Lit.
I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse.
So, now that you've heard the whole poem, it's time for some analysis. Let's start with the title, London. As a capital city, the London of the 1790s, which is when Blake published the poem, was the financial and political centre of Britain. So the setting of the poem ties in nicely with the theme of power, as London was home to the wealthy elite. But the theme of conflict becomes apparent when we consider that it was also home to many of society's poorest members, who paid the costly price for the lives of luxury enjoyed by the elite. As we go through the poem, I'll be including some more relevant contextual facts about 18th century London and about Blake himself. Let's start with lines 1 to 4. Blake begins the poem with the first-person pronoun of I, maintaining this perspective throughout the poem. Since Blake was born in London and lived there for the majority of his life, it's very likely that the speaker is himself, and he's referring to his own experiences of walking through the city. As we'll see, the poem paints London, and especially those who control it, in a highly unflattering and dismal light. Also notice that the poem begins and remains in the present tense. This seems to suggest that the current situation in London is an ongoing, inescapable reality. The speaker appears to be in a state of shock and despair over the misery he sees all around him. The aimlessness of the verb wander in the first line further reinforces this idea, and may also hint at Blake's view that this suffering has no purpose. The repetition of chartered to describe the streets and the Thames shows us that the speaker is acutely aware of the power and control that the elite have established over the city, as a chartered area is one that is legally defined and owned. The irony of a river being chartered is very clear here, but the use of the verb flow reminds us of the power of nature, a very common theme among such romantic poets as Blake, who celebrated the freedom that comes with nature. However, the distinct lack of natural imagery in the remainder of the poem makes it clear that Blake's central focus here is on man's corruption of power, rather than on the power of nature. In lines 3 to 4, the speaker tells us that he marks or notices signs of weakness and great distress on everyone's faces. The repetition of marks is reminiscent of the indelible nature of scars, which again suggests that the state of suffering the people of London are in is a permanent one. Similarly, the alliterative weakness and woe evokes a tone of deep sadness, as if the speaker is weeping at the sight of those around him. In lines 5 to 8, Blake uses the anaphora of every, highlighting the universal nature of the suffering he's witnessing. The emotive reference to infant cries of fear makes the suffering all the more tragic, as it's affecting the most innocent and vulnerable members of society, children. It's worth noting here that this poem comes from a collection of Blake's known as Songs of Experience, a companion piece to his earlier collection, Songs of Innocence. Though the collections were initially separate, they were later published together in one volume entitled Songs of Innocence and of Experience, showing the two contrary states of the human soul. Blake therefore seems to suggest that experience is essentially the loss of innocence, as the harsh realities of city life deprive the young of the protection they deserve and require. This was especially true of London at the time, which was in the throes of the Industrial Revolution.
Visually, the revolution was clear in the new industrial towns, with smoking factories dominating the skyline. The cities were horrible to live in, overcrowded and dirty with dangerous conditions in the factories and strict rules and punishments.
Though this was a period of immense technological advancement and progress, Blake was highly critical of its darker side, particularly the requirement for children as young as 4 to work in dangerous and even fatal conditions. Even small mistakes could result in children being severely disciplined in the most egregious ways. Some children in factories even had their ears nailed to the table. Thus, the cries of fear the speaker hears could well be a reference to children's terror in the face of the powers that be. Blake continues to showcase the authoritarianism pervading London in his reference to every ban, which likely points to the harsh laws in place restricting people's religious and political freedom. Though Blake himself was a Christian, he was deeply critical of institutional and organised religion, blaming the Church of England for perpetuating social and spiritual oppression. The mind-forged manacles the speaker hears in line 8 can be interpreted in a variety of different ways. Blake seems to suggest that although people are not physically restrained, they're mentally trapped by restrictions that have been imposed on them for ideological reasons, hence why the manacles are mind-forged or made in people's imaginations. This is comparable to the ideas of the Enlightenment philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose works influenced the French Revolution of 1789 to 99, an event that resulted in the overthrow of the French monarchy and greatly inspired the ideals of Blake himself.
Rousseau sees natural man as independent, solitary and peaceful. Rousseau thought people were much better off without government. With the creation of agriculture, private property and the division of labour, however, came inequalities. Unequal access to resources created tension, enmity and envy. People started to become aware of their limited material situation and lack of upward mobility. They became aware of their unfreedom. This led Rousseau to claim that man is born free and is everywhere in chains.
The specific reference to manacles as a restraint is, of course, reminiscent of prisoners, which could be a criticism of how easy it was to become a criminal in such a tyrannical and authoritarian state. The fact that the speaker hears them strikes me as really interesting. As if the image of mind-forged manacles isn't enough, these restraints are also audible, which brings to my mind an image of prisoners desperately shaking their chains in an attempt to escape their situation, but to no avail. Now let's move on to lines 9 to 12. In lines 9 to 10, the speaker refers to chimney sweepers and the church. At the time, chimney sweepers were some of the poorest members of society and were often young, orphaned boys. As in the previous stanza with reference to infants, the word cry is used here to emphasise the pain and danger these children would have felt, as chimney sweeping generally brought with it a whole host of health issues, including deformed ankles, kneecaps and spines, inflammatory eye syndrome, respiratory illnesses, and even cancer. The speaker then informs us that every blackening church is appalled. The term blackening can, of course, be taken literally, representing images of both the chimney soot and the dark smoke and smog of the London skies. But another meaning of blackening is damaging or destroying one's reputation. This appears to be a continuation of Blake's attack on the church, as he represents it as a corrupt and hypocritical institution. Though the term appalls means greatly dismays or horrifies, which could be read as favourable to the church for responding appropriately to a horrific situation, in Old French, appalls literally means to grow pale. In the words of Alan Rodway in The Craft of Criticism, this line appears not so much paradoxical as plain contradictory. The church is going black and pale at the same time. The ambiguity in this section may well be a deliberate attempt on Blake's part to obfuscate this criticism and avoid being censored by the authorities. Equally, he may be calling upon the church to do more than be appalled by instead taking practical steps to improve the situation. In lines 11 to 12, Blake uses synesthesia to describe the sigh of an unfortunate soldier running in blood down the walls of a palace. This intermingling of the senses of sound and sight could be Blake emphasising the inescapable, overwhelming loss of life in war, and how those in power, in this case monarchs, have blood on their hands for any conflicts fought during their reign. Equally, since many people sigh in cases where they feel deeply hopeless or sad, it seems to suggest that such wars are futile. Though the colour red is not explicitly mentioned here, the reference to blood and palace walls is reminiscent of this typically royal colour. Yet Blake subversively swaps its regal connotations for those of violent death. This may also signify Blake's idea that there is merit to overthrowing an unjust monarchy, as evidenced in his 1791 poem, The French Revolution.
You've got that really fascinating line, hapless soldier's sighs runs in blood down palace walls. Could be a nod to revolutionary France, to what was going on at the time, but kind of also offers this image of an exploited soldier fighting in needless wars on behalf of the palace.
Again, you wouldn't use the word hapless to describe a soldier in that time. You know, these are times of empire, these are times of showing strength, of glory, you know what I mean? The idea that government could be overthrown, the idea that monarchy could be overthrown. You know, England has already executed a king 100 years before. They didn't want to do it again.
Finally, in lines 13 to 16, we get a sense of what most troubles the speaker about London. This is because line 13 begins with the Volta, but, suggesting that although the speaker hears many disturbing sounds throughout the city, it's the noise of the youthful harlot or young prostitute with her baby that is the most widespread. Blake's description of the midnight streets gives an almost supernatural feel to this last stanza, which is mirrored in the next line with the word curse. More straightforwardly, the curse that blasts the newborn infant's tear could suggest that the speaker hears prostitutes swearing in response to their babies crying. The juxtaposition of prostitution with a newborn infant is especially jarring, and again seems to suggest that London strips people of their innocence as soon as they're born. Similarly, the violent verb blasts further reinforces the pain felt by everyone the speaker encounters. Blake ends the poem with a haunting oxymoron of a disease-ridden marriage hearse, fusing together the image of a wedding with that of a funeral. By inextricably linking a celebratory occasion with a sorrowful one, Blake once again highlights how London is a city of contrasts, containing life and death, pleasure and pain, the haves and the have-nots, and ultimately the powerful and the vulnerable. For further analysis of the poem, please refer to the flirt table on the accompanying worksheet. And remember, I've been sharing my analysis of the poem. The examiners want you to share your own informed, personal response to it. So while you can certainly use my analysis to give you some ideas, you ultimately need to develop your own take on it that can be backed up by relevant references. The best way to do this is to focus on what you personally find most interesting about the poem, thinking about what the words or phrases remind you of, and tying them into the themes of power and conflict. Now, on to the quiz. I've designed these questions to help you consolidate and review the key points discussed in this video. If you haven't already, grab a pen and a piece of paper. I'll be asking 10 multiple choice questions about London. I'll read each question once and I'll pause to give you some time to write down your answer. After I've asked all the questions, I'll read out the answers so that you can give yourself a score out of 10. Here we go. Question 1. In which century did Blake publish London? Was it A, the 16th, B, the 17th, C, the 18th, or D, the 19th? Question 2. True or false? Blake uses the first-person perspective throughout the poem. Is it A, true, or B, false? Question 3. What tense is the poem in? Is it A, the past, B, the present, or C, the future? Question 4. Blake describes the streets and the River Thames as chartered. What does this mean? Is it A, free and natural, B, polluted and ruined, C, public property, or D, legally defined and owned? Question 5. Which of the following is a synonym of anaphora? Is it A, rhyme, B, repetition, C, rhetorical question, or D, rhythm? Question 6. Which of Blake's poetry collections does London come from? Is it A, Songs of Innocence, or B, Songs of Experience? Question 7. Which revolution was London undergoing at the time of Blake's writing? Was it A, the cognitive, B, the agricultural, C, the scientific, or D, the industrial? Question 8. What is synesthesia? Is it A, the combining of two or more senses to describe an object or experience, B, continuation of a sentence without a pause beyond the end of a line, couplet or stanza, C, use of the same letter or sound in words close to one another, or D, the repetition of a word or phrase at the beginning of successive clauses? Question 9. Which of the following words marks a volta? Is it A, and, B, but, C, then, or D, when? Question 10. Which oxymoronic image does Blake close the poem with? Is it A, birth coffin, B, marriage hearse, C, marriage coffin, or D, wedding funeral? Now it's time for the answers. For question 1, Blake published London in the 1790s, the late 18th century, so the answer is C. For question 2, Blake begins the poem in the first person and maintains this perspective throughout, so the answer is A, true. For question 3, the poem is written in the present tense, so the answer is B. For question 4, Blake describes the streets and Thames as chartered to show that they are legally defined and owned, so the answer is D. For question 5, repetition is a synonym of anaphora, so the answer is B. For question 6, London comes from Blake's Songs of Experience collection, so the answer is B. For question 7, London was undergoing the Industrial Revolution at the time of Blake's writing, so the answer is D. For question 8, synesthesia is the combining of two or more senses to describe an object or experience, as seen in the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls, so the answer is A. For question 9, the word but marks a volta or a turn in the poem, so the answer is B. And finally, for question 10, Blake closes the poem with the oxymoronic image of the marriage hearse, so the answer is B. Remember to count your score to see how you did on the quiz, and don't forget to use the accompanying worksheets to revise and further your knowledge of London. See you in the next video.